And then President Johnson did announce that his choice was going to be Associate Justice Abe Fortas, and that touched off, through your leadership primarily, a real national debate.
He named Fortas, who was on the court, to be Chief Justice, and then he nominated Homer Thornberry from Texas, a very, very close crony of his, to fill the vacancy. Now you have to keep in mind that Fortas had been Johnson's lawyers from day one when he got into politics. When Johnson won that very controversial Senate race in Texas by 87 votes, after his lawyer Fortas had gone to Hugo Black and gotten an order of the state set aside in order to make that possible, from then on, Fortas was constant, all the time lawyer for Lyndon Johnson. And what happened and came out of this was that Fortas didn't stop being Johnson's lawyer after he got to the court. Johnson conferred with him on about everything. When there were race riots in Detroit, a political thing, essentially, Fortas was at his side advising him what to do.
Even though he was then on the Supreme Court?
He was on the Supreme Court. He did a lot of things for Johnson. These all came out, were written up in Time and Newsweek, and they just mounted it. It was obvious that he was, well, the whole doctrine of separation of powers was being ignored. This became the principal issue in terms of his record and fitness. But I think the real issue that we had to decide in the Senate is what is the Senate's role in a circumstance like this, because the Senate had gotten into the mode of more or less in our century of almost automatically approving presidential appointments. And I made I made a lot out of the fact that the Senate had a responsibility which was as important as the president's, that this is the third branch of government. And Madison wanted the Senate to make these appointments. He lost out, but it was the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, that determines who's going to go on the Supreme Court. Now, it's one thing for the Senate to routinely approve presidential appointments to cabinet positions or other positions in the executive branch, because they're only going to serve during the term of the president. But when you appoint somebody to the Supreme Court, the third branch, independent branch of government, and they're going to serve for life.
And certainly the Congress or the Senate
has a very, very important responsibility. And that was more or less the thing that I think was established with the Fortas case. And the Senate since then has looked very carefully and scrutinized every appointment that any president has made since then.
So the final disposition of the Fortas matter was that his nomination was withdrawn by President Johnson.
We had a vote before a filibuster really got underway. Mike Mansfield, as the leadership often does, will file a petition for cloture and sort of test the water and see how it was. Well, we had so much support that we almost got a majority when we only needed, at that point, you needed only one more than a third. And at that, when it was obvious that where the strength was, the next day or the day after, Fortas asked that his nomination be withdrawn. Well, I've got to add this, of course. Later on, there were rumors to this effect, but we didn't have any evidence. But later on, an investigative reporter for Life magazine was able to establish and write that while Fortas was serving on the court, he continued to be a counsel, paid counsel, for a person named Wolfson, who was reputed to have close ties to the underworld. And when that story broke, Fortas then resigned from the court. To my knowledge, the only justice in the history of the United States who has ever resigned under any kind of cloud.
Under those circumstances.
Yeah.
In 1968, there was a possibility that you would be nominated for vice president on Richard Nixon's ticket. And of course, ultimately, that could have led to the vice presidency and the presidency.
Well, it's a kind of a slim thing, but let me just add, Fred Buzzard, who was Strom Thurmond's top guy in his office, and who later was on the staff of the Nixon White House, came to me in Miami in 1968 in my hotel room and said something like this: "How would you like to be vice president?" I said, I laughed, and he said, "Well, there's a lot of interest in you." And at that time, Nixon didn't have the nomination wrapped up. Reagan, of course, controlled the California delegation. Scranton controlled the Pennsylvania. Rockefeller controlled the New York delegation. Romney controlled the Michigan delegation. Rhodes controlled the Ohio delegation. The only way that Nixon could get the nomination was to have the South go solidly for him and then pick up some more. And Buzzard was interested in whether or not I would be able to deliver the Michigan delegation. And I said, well, I'm not even going to try to deliver the Michigan delegation, and I have no, I am here to nominate our favorite son, George Romney, as a candidate for president.
And you weren't going to undercut him, or you weren't going to end run him?
Not at all, and I said right off, I have no interest, and I can't do anything like that.
Nixon went on to win the presidency, and you assumed a new position in the Senate, that of whip or assistant Republican leader.
Everett Dirksen died, and Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, who had been the Republican whip, was moving up, taking that position. And I can't remember all the details, but first thing you know, I was being supported and urged to run for the whip. It turned out that my opponent was Howard Baker of Tennessee, who was really a very good friend of mine. Incidentally, when we were first running for the Senate, the two of us, we met at the Washington National Airport and got on the same plane. The Republican National Committee had arranged for the two of us to meet then and to go up to Gettysburg to meet Eisenhower. We had a great time up there for a day or so. But anyway, to make a long story short, I beat out Howard Baker by 2 votes for the whip at that point. And that's rather ironic because later on, you know, for the leadership, Howard ran again.
In 1976.
He beat me by 1 vote.
Yes, yes.
But we were good friends then, and we're still good friends.
Well, then in 1972, another election rolled around, and this time a little bit like 1966, the Democrats managed to nominate their then current grand champion vote-getter, Attorney General Frank Kelly. That was a very tough and interesting race. What do you recall about it?
Well, I recall that it was very tough because at that time there was no way that you could run for office and avoid the busing issue. The busing was on everybody's mind, and you had to deal with it. You had to take a position.
The question of whether children could be bused across the lines of their own school district.
That's right, yeah. And the courts were in the process of applying that to the Detroit area. I had, from the beginning, said before that I knew that the Supreme Court was going to adopt such a remedy, that wasn't going to work. You know, it's going to cause more harm than good. And that was my position throughout that 72 campaign. Frank was on the other side of it. I have no doubt that it played a big role in the outcome of the election.